Well, the book of Esther does read a bit like a summer blockbuster movie. There's the treacherous villain, Haman, Esther, the beautiful and gutsy heroine, and Mordecai, the loyal sidekick. It's a story of deception that ends well for our hero. The story takes place during a time when the Jews were living under the rule of the king of Persia. But this was never understood as anything other than a work of fiction. The story of Esther is the focus of the Jewish holiday Purim. One of the important rituals during Purim is reading the entire book of Esther out loud. What are you going to do the rest of the day? As they do, everyone cheers for the heroes, Mordecai and Esther, and boo when the villain shows up. Now, I am not going to read the whole book today, but I did decide to weave together some long excerpts so that you get a sense of the story and our hero, Esther. So settle in for the story of Esther. The book begins with the current queen of Persia, Vashti, being dethroned for disobeying the king. The king issues an order inviting all women to come in hopes of finding a new queen. Now there was a Jew whose name was Mordecai, who was among the captives carried away with the king of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. Mordecai had brought up Esther, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in the custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put into the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred. Esther was a Jew, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell anyone. Every day Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. The turn came for each girl to go in to King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was a regular period of their cosmetic treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics for women. When the girl went in to the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she went in, then in the morning she came back to the second harem, and she did not go to the king again, unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to the king in his royal palace, the king loved Esther more than all of the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were being gathered together, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting by the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who had guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to assassinate the king. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows. The next chapter introduces Haman, the king's muscle. When Mordecai refuses to bow, when Haman comes to the gate, Haman gets mad. And knowing Mordecai is a Jew, Haman goes to the king and says, "A certain people in our midst refuse to obey the king and must be killed." Now the king didn't know which people this was, but gives the order to kill them all. Mordecai finds out that the king has ordered all the Jews to be killed and sends word to Esther through the king's servant Hathach, asking if she can go and beg the king to save their people. Continuing. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. But who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." So meanwhile, the king is grateful for the tip that stopped his assassination and decides, even though Mordecai is a Jew, he should be honored for saving his life. The king, ironically, asks Haman to honor Mordecai, which secretly humiliates Haman. But the fate of the Jews is still in the balance. Continuing. So the king and Haman went to the feast, the second feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. And the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then the king said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? And where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king orders the death of Haman. But what about the king's edict? Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote, giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming for my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" And the king said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman. They have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." And the king's edict went out far and wide, saving the Jews. May these words be to us our light and our life. Did you know that the book of Esther almost didn't make it into the Bible? For centuries, Jews and Christians questioned whether or not it should be included. Even Martin Luther once wrote, "I am so great an enemy to Esther that I wish it had not come to us at all." Why the controversy? First and perhaps foremost, if you listened closely to these sections, or if you've read the whole book, the word God does not appear anywhere in the book of Esther. Unlike the rest of the Bible, there's no direct mention of the involvement or influence of God in the story at all. Second, there's no mention of other biblical themes like Jewish law, or the covenant, or dietary restrictions, or Jerusalem. In fact, there are no spiritual concepts mentioned either. Leaving all that out makes the book feel a little odd compared to the rest of the Bible, perhaps a little out of place. Most scholars agree that the book of Esther is from a different genre than the rest of the Bible. It's more like a novella, a work of historical fiction rather than a testimony. As a result of the absence of spiritual language, Esther is considered by many to be the most secular book in the Bible. And perhaps it is then up to the reader, up to us, to answer the question, where is God in the book of Esther, in the story? Well, the story begins in dire circumstances. Living under Persian rule, the Jews are invisible and without power or freedom. As a Jewish woman, Esther has little choice over her life. When the call went out from the king to gather all of the young women, Esther, and women like her, had to go. Fearing for her safety, Mordecai tells her to hide her identity. And day after day in the king's harem, she's forced to receive cosmetic treatments. You can imagine what that might mean, covering her face, in hopes of one day pleasing the king. For 12 months, it says, she waited before she was brought to him. And judged solely on her physical beauty and the likely favors she performed for the king, Esther is made queen, again without a voice and without a choice. Like so many women before and after her, Esther has no say about what happens to her body. Her only perceived value comes from her physical beauty. But things change when Esther is crowned queen. Mordecai sees this opportunity for her to use her authority to save the Jewish people, but Esther hesitates. It's in this exchange between the two of them that something powerful happens. At first, she is just simply afraid. She isn't sure she has what it takes to stand up to the king. Besides, even as the queen, she could still be put to death for just trying to speak to him. But Mordecai believes in her and pushes back, saying this beautiful line, "Perhaps you have become queen for just such a time as this." And as often is the case in the Bible, just one verse later, which feels like a moment, Esther has made up her mind to talk to the king, saying, "If I perish, I perish." While we admire Esther's courage, we also have to stop and just deplore the ways women have been forced to sacrifice their bodies and risk their lives to gain power. This still happens, unfortunately, today, and all of us, particularly men, must protest the objectification of women and dismantle systems of power that discriminate and perpetuate violence against women. Esther executes her clever plan and turns the king against Haman and saves the Jews. We cheer as Esther is transformed from voiceless concubine to Jewish superhero. And we aren't told exactly how this transformation happens, where she finds the courage to face the king. What is it that moves her from cowering in fear to faithful action? Whatever it is, we often feel we don't have enough of it. Overwhelmed By the moments such as this one that the world is in now, we wonder how to find the courage to do what we are called to do. Perhaps that's why my mother painted this icon of Esther, to accompany her as she prayed for courage for her own life. Indeed, Esther is an empowering figure and has been for many women. I was excited to discover a few weeks ago that the scripture chosen for the UCC's annual meeting being held this very weekend was going to be from the book of Esther. I took it as a sign that God had approved of our summer series on women in the Bible, and I hope to get something out of the event to share with you this morning. Focusing on this idea that we are called for such a time as this, the keynote speaker, Reverend Ben Guess, reminded us yesterday that sometimes we misunderstand this call, assuming that more will be required of us than we are able to give. He shared a story from Fred Craddock, one of the best storytellers and preachers of our time. As a child, Fred remembers traveling with his family. They always had to stop when they passed a memorial or monument, and they would get out of the car and read the inscription. This commemorates so-and-so who courageously gave their life here. And maybe they would even take a picture. Later, Fred remembers lying awake in his bed, trying to imagine himself giving his life for something important. What would it be? What would it take? Would he even be willing to give his life for his faith, for Jesus? He said, quote, "Laying in my bed, I pictured myself standing in front of a firing squad and being told, 'Deny Jesus and you will live.' I bravely told the story of Jesus, and the command was given, 'Ready, aim, fire.' Flags were at half-mast, widows were crying, and a monument was erected where I gave my life for Christ." He continues, "Nobody told me lying in that bed that I couldn't give my life for Christ all at once by writing one big check. Instead," he says, "it has been decades of writing little checks. 85 cents here, $1.39 there. Giving my life for something for Christ has meant being faithful in the small things over and over throughout my life." You see, one of the problems of comparing ourselves to heroes like Esther is that no one else but Esther was in the position to influence the king of Persia, just as no one else is living your life but you. The real question is, how do we find the courage to live our lives, to face the king who seems to have power over us? And I don't mean the one who thinks he's king in Washington, but the one who rules your immediate world, whom you live with every day. Perhaps a voice even within you. How do we continue to chip away at the power of this king, even if it is just 12 cents today, 35 cents tomorrow, $1.10 next week? After the keynote, we told stories around our table of a time when we had to be brave. No one had a story to tell like Esther's. Instead, people talked of dealing with the loneliness after the end of a relationship, facing the fear of disappointing someone, trying to drive home after the drowning death of a child, and stepping into the unknown of a C-section. We decided that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and trying to do what needs to be done anyway, at least some of the time. Someone shared a beautiful pearl of wisdom from Bernice Johnson Regan, a civil rights activist and the founder of the musical group Sweet Honey in the Rock, who said she hopes she has the courage to act on at least 1 out of every 4 opportunities that come her way. Might we hope to have the bravery of Esther to answer 1 out of every 4 times God calls us. When Jews celebrate Purim, they come to the synagogue in costume. I've heard sometimes even wearing their Halloween costumes. The costumes are a reminder of how Esther had to hide her identity to win the freedom of her people. Even though we believe people shouldn't have to hide who they are to gain recognition or be heard, we must acknowledge that sometimes oppressed people have needed to use deception merely to survive. Ultimately, the story of Esther and Purim is about resiliency. It is about the ability of God's people to survive. The costumes also signify the hidden face of God in this story. So I leave you with the question, where did you see God in this story?